Okay, everybody, I think I've got this set up. This usually just works just fine, and YouTube's like, nope, this isn't right. Okay. Any questions or concerns before I get going with stuff? Any questions from home? I assume you guys are tuning in from home. Maybe you're out in the parking lot in your car. Who knows, right? Okay. I think I'm good to go with this. So I left you guys off last time with, I told you a little bit about these guys and how awesome I thought they were. I want to start off with a little bit. I'm not going to show the whole thing, I don't think, because sometimes they're a little bit long. But I want to go to one of the journey of the microcosmos. There's a handful of Stentor videos, and there are a plethora of other things. So I'm just going to click on this one. I believe I saw this one a while back, and it was pretty good. I don't think we need the advertisement, but awesome socks. Okay. I said I wasn't going to see the whole thing and I just got sucked in. That's what happens with those. I find myself, I'm just like, oh my gosh, down the rabbit hole of the microcosmos. Kind of interesting. It was a few months back. I was checking some of this stuff out. And my wife's in the other room and she's like, what are you listening to? Right. And I'm like, oh, I'm watching all of these. And she's like, it sounds like you're just trying to put yourself to sleep because his voice is so soothing. And I'm like, maybe, right? But it lured me in, right? I'm like, it's calmed me down, right? This was good. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing that. I personally think that channel it is just full of some fantastic videos. They have, I mentioned before, a pond that they typically tap into and gather some of these things. And it is really impressive to see some of the stuff. Okay. I think I just need to make that full screen, then it's all good. All right, if you're tuning in at home and you're not seeing the PowerPoint, then pipe up and let me know, but I think we're in business. So there were lots of things in there that I was like, holy cow. I don't want to be the guy that just keeps pausing it, right, to spout off details, but pretty cool. And you could see with some of them, this one right here with the cilia up at the top, we showed the cytostome on, well, right here, right? And you could see a few of them where it kind of swirled around and you could tell that's its stinking mouth, right? So there's speculation. What I really found kind of interesting in there when they were talking about putting these suckers in a solution of sugar water, they lose the cilia. Why? I think I've got some ideas, right? If you're bathed in nutrients, do you need this mechanism to try to propel little foodstuffs in? Heck no, you don't, right? We can just absorb this stuff, right? Simple diffusion, right? There's a big concentration of glucose. I'm bathed in food, right? Why do I need all of this extra stuff to get it in? I'll just absorb it, right? That makes sense, right? And then take them out of that and put them back into the pond water, and you're gonna watch these guys need to get those cilia to help propel it. Pretty stinking awesome, I think. I was also very impressed to hear about the fusing, or grafting. That's pretty cool. So many things that I'm like, holy cow. All right, I'm glad you guys can see it. So cool. And just to see them, seeing a picture of them, I don't think it really does them justice, but seeing them moving around and pulling things in and to see little bits of stuff inside of them that they are feeding on is, to me, it's just flat out awesome. Okay, enough of that. Although I still feel like we could probably just talk about them all day long. That's okay. So here we're looking at a different, this is a oomycete, a saprobe. There are all sorts of things that we might classify as saprobic, like the detritivores, the things in the environment breaking down leaf litter or dead organisms, something like that. A saprobe is feeding on something like that. In this case, it's an insect. You can't see the insect, but this water mold is basically surrounding it. It's not fungus, but similar, right? As it's engulfing it. It's another just kind of crazy, and we'll skip over that. Yes?
How does it obtain the dead insects? Does it just wait for them to like fly in or something like a spider?
I think this, so my gut tells me we're probably looking at like a cave or something. This stuff is probably just there. The insect dies and it just kind of collects on. I think that's probably the idea. But I don't know for sure. Now it makes me wonder, does microcosmos have something about these guys? Maybe. There's probably some crazy details about oomycetes. I'm not 100% with that, but I would think they're probably it's just there. And then once the organism is present, you may have one or two of those cells and they proliferate very fast because all of a sudden there's a bunch of food. That's what I would think. So the euglena, this image of euglena, I think is pretty awesome. And it's one that, my gut tells me we saw some of these suckers in that video as well. There were lots of things that were nice and green in that water, kind of swimming around, probably some euglena. And I know there's some videos that go into detail about some of these guys as well. But typically when you're looking at something like that, you're going to find all sorts of different organisms in that type of a habitat. And euglena is definitely something you'd expect to find in like some pond water, all right? So lots of chloroplasts in here. There's also this little stigma. This is an eye spot. It's not a true eye, but it's a primitive eye, if you will, and it's a photoreceptor. There are pigments within there, rhodopsin pigments, that allow the protist to basically gauge where it's at in the water column. How deep are you in the pond? The closer to the surface in the daytime, the more likely you are to be able to photosynthesize. So that eye spot helps it to kind of gauge where it's at and move up so that it can, make some sugars. So really pretty impressive with these guys as we look at the detail and the cartoon. The pellicle, kind of little banding, and you can see some of it right here that surround it, kind of giving it a shape. Oh man, I take one quick pause because I'm just like, I need a huge breath here because I want to talk about these for a whole stinking hour. But I won't. Trypanosomes, there are all sorts of different types of trypanosomes. They all look pretty similar to what we've got up here. There is a little bit of variation. Some morphology is a little different. Some of them have a little shorter flagella, others nice long ones like we see here. It's kind of hard to recognize it. The flagella basically starts here. It goes under the membrane and then protrudes out. It creates kind of a ribbon sort of like appearance with these guys, sort of, if you use your imagination. We call it an undulating membrane, and it basically allows these guys to wriggle through their environment, kind of snake-like, all right? Impressive, all right? These guys are, some of them are parasites in people. There are some others that are parasites in other animals. There are potentials for numerous types of diseases that they can cause. One of them, as we're looking at these guys up above and seeing the human over here in the life cycle, one of them that we think about is African sleeping sickness. It is a super bad one, all right? And there are others. So we see here Trypanosoma brucei. These guys, we technically have 3 of them that are super, super similar, right? If you looked at them under the microscope, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart. It was like where he was talking about with those two types of stentors, and how do you know who they are, right? They are different, right? We give them subspecies categories because they truly are different. One of them infects livestock and causes a huge plague on agriculture or ranching in huge swaths of Africa. Massive areas, an area larger than the entire United States is plagued by these parasites, plagued by these flies that transmit these parasites, all right? So it causes huge issues, economic losses, and impacts in, protein and food supply, truly. 2 other species infect people, right? And they are a little bit different as far as maybe specific locations where we might find them, but definitely in the course of the disease, right? One of them, and we're not going to go into great detail and spout off all of this stuff, but one of them is more of an acute, more of a severe type of an infection. And it doesn't cause African sleeping sickness because you die too soon, right? You die before you ever get the chance to have any sort of central nervous system involvement, right? So the other one, and we just kind of group it all together and just say it's brucei and it causes sleeping sickness, but really there is some variation, right? And the other one is more of a kind of chronic, if you will, parasite, takes much longer within us, and it lends to having the central nervous system involvement, the sleeping sickness, and it is super bad. The other one that's plaguing livestock, it basically causes similar sorts of situations, a sleeping sickness-like sort of problem, and those animals, super lethargic, they don't eat, they get emaciated, they starve to death, basically. Skin and bones is what you're left with, all right? Terrible, all right? So there's all sorts of issues with them, and again, huge areas where we may find the parasite endemic, right? So a couple of details with this. I gave you some thoughts about some variation, but all of them get transmitted by this fly. It's kind of hard to see, but it's a tsetse fly. These flies take the blood meal And as they are doing that, we'll start right up here. So the fly's already infected with the parasite. We'll get to that as we move around. So the fly's taking a blood meal and it injects the trypanosome into the circulation. There are technically, although they all pretty much look the same as we're looking at these guys right here. These guys have some different morphologies as they go through development from the fly to the human, to the human, to the fly. They change the littlest bit, right? And there are points in the development within the fly where that parasite's infective. And if the fly were to feed and it's not quite at that point, well, it's probably pretty likely it's not going to be up in the saliva at this point. But if it is to the saliva and it's not fully developed, well, that bit of the parasite that gets inoculated in, it's not going to be infected, right? And it's the same in the human. If it's not at the proper developmental stage and that fly taps into us, it takes a blood meal, it's not going to be infected to the fly, right? So it's got to kind of be optimal circumstances in both situations for the parasite to continue its life cycle, right? And again, we're not really seeing that. That doesn't really matter in here, but there are differences. So the parasite gets in, it gets into our circulation, it multiplies in a similar way like bacteria. These guys replicate by binary fission, one replicating into two, all right? It's not like our malaria parasites that go through schizogeny and one of them generates a dozen or whatever, right? So they go through these rounds of replication, binary fission, creating big populations. We find them typically in the blood, as we see up here with this blood smear, but they can be found in the lymphatics, cerebrospinal fluid, if we're talking the one that actually is going to progress to that, all right? So from the circulation, these parasites get tapped into by a new tsetse fly. As it ingests it within the midgut, it starts to replicate again by binary fission. It progresses, basically gets out of the gut and migrates up through the hemosyl into the salivary glands. It goes through some more developmental shifts, and then that fly is basically ready to go. And when a tsetse fly takes a blood meal, all of these blood-sucking arthropods, when they feed on us, they're injecting saliva, they're injecting anticoagulants and some analgesics. Most of the good bloodsuckers, you don't know they're sucking your blood, right? You don't even feel it, right? You might feel it afterward, but you don't feel it when they're on you, all right? And that sets the stage when we're thinking the potential to transmit parasites. That's fantastic, right? You go undetected, and little do you know that this fly or a mosquito, whatever it is pumping other stuff into you as well, right? Maybe these guys. And, I think as I look at this, it's something that I just think is awesome. I think this is a beautiful image. I think these little trypanosomes look so cool. I would not want to see this in my blood smear, right? I wouldn't think they were that cool then, but just looking at them, I'm just like, wow, it's so fascinating. And to think that these crazy little protists can cause such huge problems, all right? And yet they look like they're almost innocuous, right? You're like, what could they do? Pretty impressive. So there are massive efforts to try to eradicate, to try to combat. The question of eradication is basically you probably aren't going to be able to, right? But there are other things like trying to get cattle that have the ability to be tolerant of the parasite so they don't get infected. And then you don't have these issues, right? These tolerant cattle may set the stage for it to be able to not cause huge problems. That's not something, what do we do about ourselves, right? There's still issues with that. But if, further research is poured into it, we may recognize some mechanisms to really try to combat that. Okay. Oh no. This one, here's another, almost this whole chapter of stuff. I'm like, I could probably talk for an hour about this one too. Enterobius vermicularis. Oh my goodness, this is a good one. This is a type of roundworm or a nematode, all right? So we are shifting, again, we're thinking eukaryotes as we're moving through here. So we're shifting into multicellular ones at this point, although these are still very small, all right? A couple millimeters. So you could see them, but they're little, all right? Enterobius vermicularis is called the pinworm. It's also been called the seat worm. These guys are all over the place, is probably the best way to really think about it. We could say they're ubiquitous. They're stinking everywhere, all right? That's a little bit disturbing, all right? There are all sorts of details about these worms. If you are infected with them, you may recognize it. You may not. There are numerous infections that are asymptomatic. No issues, all right? Even the people that are symptomatic, and typically kids, even when you are symptomatic, it's typically not something that's a huge issue, all right? An infection with this parasite isn't something that's on the radar as being something we'd classify as a life-threatening infection. These aren't going to kill you, all right? You might think so, and you might lose some sleep over it, all right? But when it's all said and done, it's ultimately really not that big of a deal, all right? And as I say that, you're like, wait a minute. If I have these things, I think that's a big deal, right? And I would think the same thing, right? And it, you know, there are a few things that kind of creep me out when I think about some organisms. And pinworms are one that kind of get me a little bit. I kind of get a little bit disturbed, all right? Not as disturbed as lice. Just saying lice makes my scalp itch a little bit, all right? I don't know why, but they make me a little bit disturbed, all right? And I don't know why. That's just the way it is, all right? Pinworms are right up there. They're like number 2 on my list of disturbers, right? Nightmare worthy, all right? So Enterobius, we get infected through the ingestion of an egg. There are all sorts of problems when we think about this because it's like a contamination situation. Typically, when we think about our pinworm infestations, it starts with the kids, right? That's usually, and I don't want to blame all of the children on the planet, but we should, all right? There are some problems, all right? And little kids put things in their mouths, they put their fingers in their mouths, there's all sorts of potentials for stuff to get brought in there, and the potential for eggs to be ingested, well, it's huge, all right? These eggs can be all over the place. They know, they really get everywhere, and they find them, you know, if you wanted to do some studies, they have looked for these things all over the place. They find them in schoolrooms, they find them in daycares, places where kids are, you're probably gonna find some of these eggs, right? And as you're all sitting there, you're like, wait a minute, I was a kid, right? What the heck are you talking about, right? They're everywhere and kids are issues with this stuff. Do I have worms, right? If that's not something you're asking yourself right now, I think you better be, right? Could you have some of these suckers right now? I think you could, right? I hope you don't, right? But maybe you do, all right? So the eggs are very, very small. They get all over the place. We think contamination issue. They basically get into the dust. And they're spread all over the place. So individual, it's kind of lice-like when we think about decontamination. If you've got somebody that has lice, you've got some serious issues to ensure that you've really got rid of all of that stuff and dealt with it, right? Or it's going to come back. And it's no different with pinworms, all right? These eggs have the potential to be all over the place. So they, in your, usually a kid, the kid may not really be seeing lots of problems. There are definitely some symptoms that we can describe it later. We'll maybe spout it off right now because I love them. But the idea of some of the bigger issues might be pushed more to the parent, maybe the mother, just kind of depends, all right? Someone takes this kid into the doctor, finds out what's up, and then is told some details about kind of what I was just saying. These eggs get all over the place. Now you got to decontaminate. And where do you start? Well, you better start at the ceiling, and then you better work all of the way down, right? And if you don't, completely decontaminate, cleaning. If you've got carpet, you got to completely clean that. All of the bedding, any sorts of little kids, all the stuffed animals, all of that stuff has to be dealt with, right? You have to clean all of it and then probably do it again, all right? Because you thought you got it, but you didn't. Yes.
So for that, you said like start from the ceiling down to the floor, but like, is there really like anything at the ceiling?
Well, I mean, it's like highly unlikely that the dust is going to be up on the ceiling, but why not, right? Do you have a ceiling fan? Have you seen the dust that gets up on there if it's not turned on? There's dust all over the place, right? You don't know where they're at. They, like curtains, the upholstery, couches and chairs and all of that stuff can have it. So I would start at the top, right? And then another part of me is like, what I would do is just get the kids, get in the car, and go to a new house. Right? That's what you should do. And that's what you do if you got bed bugs. Yeah.
Would like fumigation get them?
I don't know the answer to that about fumigation. I know bed bugs and lice. We could think about some stuff maybe like that. Pinworms, I don't know. I don't know if you could fumigate. I bet a company would say they would, right? But I don't know. Possibly, all right? So we will talk a little more about pinworms, all right? There are definitely some issues when we get later on and think nematodes, but it could be, a little kid starts having issues, nightmares, nervousness, grinding their teeth, something like that, that is not normal, right? There could be issues of like night terrors, butt scratching. That's a good one, right? That definitely sets the stage where you're maybe wondering what's going on, right? And as a parent, there's all sorts of things I think about. I'm like, is that kid just learning to potty train? Are they wiping their own butt? If that's the case, they're probably not doing a very good job. So we need to talk to them a little bit about that. But if they are, and it's all fine and good, and you've still got some scratching issues, there's some problems, right? So you can see here the eggs and the perianal folds. That lends to some of the scratching and issues, the irritation. The worm, the female, basically migrates down to the anus, pokes out and lays her eggs, and then she'll crawl back up in there, all right? The male, basically, he finds the female, copulation happens, and about right after that, he's spent, he dies, all right? The eggs develop within her. She makes a couple migrations, lays the eggs, she's gonna die as well. Doesn't matter, there's a plethora of them, and the eggs are all over. So re-inoculation or reinfection happens as the eggs get re-ingested. Crazy. You can find them in the wee hours and do a Scotch tape prep where you tape a little bit onto the anus. It needs to be like clear packing tape. I was schooled. It's not like Scotch tape that's semi-opaque. You can't see the eggs as well. But clear, then you can. Then you'd put it under a dissecting scope. They look like little coffee beans, but it's not coffee beans, right? Different.
If you could stop the reinfection cycle, does this just run its course and then the person's?
Yes, if you could do that, and there are some deworming drugs that will help to rid you of that. But the question is, can you truly stop that, right? And that's where kind of the psychosis comes in, and you're like, holy cow, I didn't have OCD until now, and now I have to completely clean everything. As you walk in, I have to spray you down and decontaminate you, right? Crazy stuff like that, right? It's not a super huge issue inside of you, but inside of you it is, right? You're like, holy cow, they're everywhere, right? So we'll talk a little more about it later, but you've got most of the good details, and probably I probably creeped you out a little bit if I didn't. How about one more? This one will get you. I mentioned the butt scratcher. There are definitely instances when you got a little kid, usually, that is also a booger picker, right? Butt scratching and booger picking set the stage for some serious issues. And there are documented cases of little kids with pinworm of the nose because they put the egg up in there and then it hatches and now you got worms in your nose. Awesome, right? And now if you weren't creeped out, you better be for sure. That's disturbing. I love it. Okay. Now you're like, oh man.
I can't.
You're done, right? There you go. Yeah, just put them in a bowl. It's fine. It's fine. You don't know. You don't know. So I teach lots of stuff like this and parasitology, and we think about worms, all of these different things. My oldest, when he was just little, maybe 5, maybe no, not 5. He was probably 7 or 8. He comes out of the bathroom and he's like, Dad, there's something in the toilet, right? And I'm like, what's going on, dude? Right? And he's like, I think it's a worm, right? And I'm like, what in the heck? I hope it's not, right? And I walk in there and sure enough, there's this weird thing in the toilet, kind of whitish looking, very little, but still something, right? And I'm like, what? That's weird, right? I don't like the looks of that, right? I must do some further investigating, right? Is what I think. I've got to look at that sucker, right? So I'm pretty good with chopsticks, right? I know how to work them, right? Because my thought is, how am I going to get this sucker out of the toilet, right? I don't want to reach in and just get it, right? That's gross, right? Even what I'm telling you is gross, but is it grosser than pinworm of the nose? I don't think so, right? So I'm like, what am I going to do, right? I grab these chopsticks, I chopstick it out, I put it in a little Ziploc bag, and I bring it into school because I'm going to look at it under the microscope, right? In your lab, that's where I'm going. Not really. So it requires a dissecting microscope, not a compound microscope. So I put it on there and I'm looking at it and I'm like, well, that looks really weird, right? I don't think that's a worm, but it looks really weird, right? I don't know what I think about that, right? There was another guy, another professor that teaches like some invertebrate zoology, so some worm stuff as well, some more parasite, but other things along with that, more than just parasites, right? So I got him in, and he takes a peek in there, and he's like, "Huh, I don't think that's anything that's alive, right? I mean, it's obviously not alive now, but I don't think it ever was alive, right? I don't think it's a worm, right? And I'm like, okay, we'll just let it go, right? A little bit later, a couple weeks go by, he comes out again and he's like, there's something else. And now I'm like freaking out, right? I'm like, this kid's got worms, right? What am I gonna do, right? Chopsticks again, right? So I'm re-examining, right? Get my consult. He also says, no, I don't think so. So then I have to, it's important to do a little bit of patient history, right? You got to start talking about stuff, right? What's going on? What have you been eating? Where have you been, right? Have you traveled abroad? I know he hasn't, right? He's my kid, right? So what's going on here? Come to find out, he's been eating string. It's string he's pooping out. I'm like, what? What in the world, right? Little piece of string, right?
Why is he eating the string?
Right? He's 8 years old. What the hell are you gonna do? Out on the playground, ate a piece of string, right? Did it again, ate another one, right? What's it matter, right? It's just a piece of string, right? And then he craps it out and tells me there's a worm. And I'm like, what? He didn't know it. He didn't know. He thought it was a worm. But then we figure out, oh, string. Right? So now it's a joke. I'm like, what do you want for dinner? String. Now he's 16. That's not funny anymore. Right? But it is to me, right? It is to my wife. She's like, oh yeah, you want a bowl of string? That's good, right? So you may say, I don't want kids, but it's, it's hard to say. You never know. Yeah, it is entertaining. There's all sorts of interesting things that I have seen that I'm just like, holy cow, right? And they would just die if they knew I'm telling some of these stories. My other one, my littler one, who is not little anymore, I changed his diaper one day and I'm like, holy cow, that's a full grape, right? But he didn't eat grapes. He ate a raisin. He ate the raisin, swallowed it whole, and it rehydrated, and there was a grape. And I was like, that is crazy. Who knew you could poo a grape, right? There you go, all right? Fun facts, who knew? All right. It's weird, right? And there was a show, kids say the darndest things or whatever. Now I'm thinking it's like kids poo the darndest things. You don't know what's going to show up in there, right? Who knows? And so now I'm just like, it's probably string, right? You see, I'm like, that's probably string, right? It's tapeworm, probably string, right? That's my first go-to, right? And then I'm like, nope, it's an actual worm, right? But my first thought was string. Okay. That's not true. So here we got a couple of different types of worms. We saw the roundworm, although we only saw a little bit of our roundworm. These are all different flatworms. And there's a bunch of different types of flatworms. There's a lot of roundworms as well. But we can see some that are kind of leaf-like. There are others that are very long, ribbon-like, right? So tapeworms and so cestode and trematode, both flatworms, but the cestodes are the tapeworms, and these guys, the trematodes, we would call flukes, right? And there are numerous types and things where we may eat something like undercooked meat and get a worm, or we could eat some vegetation and potentially get a worm. It's not like the vegetarians are all good to go. You can get worms from eating some vegetables, right? And my kids are like, I told you, right? So I'm like, nope. What do you get from eating string? A crazy dad is what you get. All right. So I'm going to tell you one end story, and we will leave it at this because we're just about out of time. This whole lecture just went downhill, right? So there was a professor here that was from Alaska, And he was a mammologist, so he studied like big game animals was what he was really focusing on. And the story was from, I'm assuming it was still Alaska. This game warden was going around to a bunch of different hunting camps, talking to the hunters, seeing if they got anything, just little bits of stuff that he's talking to them, right? This guy comes up to one of these camps. These hunters have just harvested an elk. They're in the process of dressing it out, and they've got the liver, and they're a tradition for them is once they harvest an animal, we're gonna eat the liver, all right? Nothing like fresh liver, all right? And so the warden's standing there talking to them, and they're doing all of this stuff, and they're frying up this liver, and they're saying all of this stuff about these little livers. As they're eating the, little pieces or whatever, like we eat the little ones first, and then we go to the bigger liver. And the warden's like, little liver, right? There aren't little livers, right? And he looks down and sees really what's going on. Right here, little livers, right? These are liver flukes, right? And they, although this looks kind of pale, they look pretty much the same as a liver, right? Same color. That's what they're eating, right? That's what they were eating, right? They taste delicious. We eat them first, then we eat the other. And the warden tells them, you're actually eating these worms, right? These flukes. They didn't like what he was saying. They're like, oh, you just go on to the next camp. And I assume they continued to eat the little livers, all right? With that said, farewell. Go have a sandwich. Or take a shower, right? Good times.
One time, one of my kids, little, ate so many peanuts at a party that he, I swear to God, was too big.
Just a peanut.
Just peanuts.
It's like the candy bar that's all coated in peanut, the 100 grand or whatever. You're like, what the heck is that?
I'm doing the mom thing.
Yeah.
I'm like